All right. Hello, class. I picked Brazil to do my introduction to for a Latin American country because it's always kind of interested me, and I knew that there was a lot of corruption going on right now, but I wanted to kind of learn more about it. So this really helped me out with it, and I hope it's good and informative. So Brazil is geographically pretty big. It's the fifth largest country in the world, and it encompasses three kind of major areas, which are the Amazon River Basin, the Brazilian highlands, and then a tropical savanna. It was originally a Portuguese colony, and some of the major cities are Brasilia, which is a little bit more inland, which is the de jure capital of Brazil. Rio de Janeiro would often be considered the social capital of Brazil, and Salvador is kind of the black cultural capital of Brazil. It's got the highest percentage of black and mixed Brazilians. So geographically, Brazil faces a lot of challenges. The Amazon River Basin area is right around here. It's pretty inhospitable. There are tribes living there still to this day, but it's really impossible to develop agriculture into that area as well. So most of Brazil's population centers are right along the western coast. The biggest, obviously, being Rio de Janeiro, and then there's Sao Paulo right here. So a lot of those population centers are concentrated in that particular area of the Brazilian highlands. Um, One big thing for Brazil is that it's connected. Um, it borders pretty much every Latin American country besides Chile and Argentina, and that is particularly interesting when it comes to its place in Latin America. So, um, in Brazil, it's about 66% Roman Catholicism as far as religion breakdown, and then about 20% Protestant, and then the rest are minor religions. So it's pretty dominantly Christian and pretty dominantly Catholic as well. Um, Race in Brazil is viewed a lot differently than in the United States. How we view race because of just in general, a larger mixing between the Portuguese immigrants that came in, African slaves, and indigenous people. When the Portuguese came over originally, there weren't a lot of Portuguese women that came over with them. So of course they started having sex with indigenous people and Africans, and then later on in Brazil's history, there began a process where the government started trying to whiten its people by giving free immigration to a lot of Europeans to come over and essentially try to whitewash the race of Brazil. So slave culture did bring a lot of important things to Brazil as we see today. Um, One is the Catholic and African religion, Candomblé, which essentially was outlawed at some points during the whitewashing of Brazil. And then capoeira, which was it developed with slaves on sugar plantations as a way to disguise their martial arts training. Capoeira combined martial arts training and dance. So whenever the slave masters came by, they would just pretend like they were dancing to the drum, and whenever the slave masters left them, they could continue their martial arts practice. So soccer today is an incredibly important cultural aspect to Brazilians. They've won 5 World Cups overall, I believe, and they hosted the last World Cup in 2014, even though that did not end very well for them there. So Brazil's economy is traditionally one of the best in the world, one of the best in Latin America. It's one of the fastest developing economies in the world. But recently, there's been obviously a lot of problems with that. There was a major recession a couple years ago. Um, and there's a lot of fiscal debt. Fiscal deficit. The government's spending more than it should, and then there's also a lot of corruption scandals going on right now between private companies and government officials. Brazil's also part of Mercosur, which is an organization of a couple different Latin American countries. I think Argentina and Venezuela among them. And Mercosur is a little bit protectionist because of the volatility of foreign markets right now, but they're hoping to become a little bit more globalist in the future, I think. So Portugal Portugal came to Brazil in 1500, and obviously immediately claimed it for the empire. It started colonizing there, and then the cane sugar industry really took off. A huge demand created immediately, and so Brazil became the biggest state in the New World that had the highest amount of African slaves being sent there, with incredibly brutal conditions, arguably way worse than slaves in America had it. So eventually Brazil gained its independence in 1822 after a war with Portugal. There was a really long thing that happened essentially where Portugal's mainland was threatened, and so the royal family came to Brazil, and essentially Portuguese royal family got separated from the nobles in Portugal, and it's a very complicated situation. So the National Constitution of Brazil was ratified in 1824, and they became an independent nation. But they essentially maintained either a military junta in control or a monarchy, and slavery until 1888. And at that point, it became a democratic republic. So the government structure today of Brazil, the citizens elect the head of state every 4 years, and the citizens also elect representatives of their bicameral legislature, pretty much exactly like we do in the United States. The head of state, the president, appoints justices in the national judiciary and also the ministers of the state, minister of education, and the like. Voting and registration is actually compulsory in Brazil. You're fined if you do not vote, which is a little bit interesting. And also, a couple of years ago, I believe, voting was moved down so that if you're 16 to 18, I believe you are allowed to vote, but voting is not compulsory. So Brazil also has a multi-party system, probably a little bit farther left than those parties tend to be a little bit farther left than the American system, but probably not by too much. There are a lot of current political issues for Brazil. In 2013, a lot of people know that protests became huge and violent when Brazil was about to start hosting the World Cup, and again later the Olympics. And so essentially because the people were wondering why public transport fare was going up and up and up, and the government had money to spend on World Cup stadiums. And so that led to a lot of violence and a lot of dissatisfaction with the government. There's I think it's called the Free Transit Movement. I'm not actually 100% sure, but essentially in Sao Paulo, this public transport issue became really so bad because the roads and the infrastructure for public transit is just so awful, and the fares keep going up that poor people essentially have no class mobility. So in 2015, Petrobras, which is an oil company, was implicated in a corruption scandal, essentially at the same time as Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil, was the head of Petrobras. So that was not great for her. And so then later in that same year, Dilma Rousseff's campaign borrowing with tied to government corruption was exposed. That campaign borrowing was illegal. In 2016, Dilma Rousseff was voted to an impeachment trial, and she was voted out of office. And Michel Temer becomes president, and the Senate approved a government spending freeze, essentially to try and start fixing the um, the deficit issue. And another big thing that's coming up is in October, Brazil will hold their next presidential election, and it's looking like Michel Temer will be lining up to run, and then potentially also Brazil's old president Lula. So Brazil plays an interesting role in Latin America. For the most part, actually, despite its size, the big buffer zones in the Amazon River basin essentially means that Brazil has surprisingly little interaction locally. Brazilians tend to feel more isolated from the rest of Latin America due to language and that buffer zone. But there are little things like boundary disputes with Uruguay over a particular island. Um, there's a lot of smuggling going on across the Uruguayan border, and then the Colombian paramilitary operations are, of course, bothering locally Venezuela and Brazil. So I think there are some big questions for Brazil's future, and how they're answered will mean a lot for us as political scientists. How will Brazil reconcile government overspending with the pressure to lower public transport costs, the need to police favelas, and the obligation to improve infrastructure? I think that's probably the main one to kind of strengthen its economy. I didn't talk about favelas before, but they're essentially high density, very dangerous parts of big cities like Rio de Janeiro. Rioja is one of the biggest favelas in Rio de Janeiro. And favelas they essentially were built without government oversight at all. So in general, they tend to be pretty lawless. And gangs tend to run rampant there. How will Brazil address government corruption? Will there be a legitimate attempt to address government corruption? I would probably think not, but we'll see. How will Brazil's presidential election change its political landscape? How will Brazil consolidate control over its territory, like in the buffer zones? Talking about the need to essentially connect the eastern coast cities to the mainland of Brazil. So thank you for listening. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and here are some of the places where I got my information. In particular, I really enjoyed this documentary called Black in Latin America. And I got a little bit too far into, I think, the racial aspects of Brazil, but it was really interesting. So I hope you enjoyed.